This episode of Shaun of the South is brought to you by Case Knives, a tradition of my family dating back to my granddaddy, the fisherman, the woodcarver, and the Southern Baptist, who always said the best cure for idle hands is to build something. So keep your hands sharp with a Case knife.
Hey, you are listening to Shaun of the South, and I'm your host tonight, Sean Dietrich, and man, we got a great show lined up here for you tonight, a great show coming to you live via the podcast airwaves and the radio waves all over this fine nation. This group of folks you see behind me here on the stage, this lovely young woman and man are going to play something for you here. This is the Chatham Rabbits, everybody, the Chatham Rabbits. This portion of our program is brought to you by Visit North Alabama. The Mountain Lakes Tourist Association traveled to visit the 16 North Alabama counties and make this state what it is. Festivals, attractions, and restaurants all over Alabama. Blount County, Cherokee County, Colbert County, Coleman County, DeKalb County, Etowah County, Franklin County, Jackson County, Lauderdale County, Lawrence County, Limestone County, Madison County, Marion County, Marshall County, Morgan County, Winston County. Or visit the Horton Mill Bridge just off Alabama 75, about 5 miles north. Laniana, built in 1935, all the work was done strictly by hand tools. Think about that for a second. Or how about the North Alabama Barbecue Trail, trek across North Alabama on a holy, sacred pilgrimage of saturated fat and slow-smoked pork. Other states do their barbecue differently than they do in Alabama, and that's not to say that they don't do it right. But that is absolutely to say that they do it dead wrong. Visit North Alabama today, because whatever you want to do, you can do it better in North Alabama. Look them up at Visit North Alabama or northalabama.org or hashtag Visit North AL.
I've been sitting here thinking back over my life, all of the good things, the trouble and strife, and my share
the sputters I can't seem to get at. Every year on the 4th of July, we gather round the fire, telling your stories and drinking wine, pretending we're alright. My blood runs thick, but I smile through the pain. The venom of my kin to blame. Pinch my cheek to wake me up. Don't tell me how I have changed. You're always trying to pick a fight, saying you're just giving advice. Smile at me through the grit of your teeth. You cut me and it's your blood I bleed. Every year on the 4th of July, we gather round the fire, telling your stories and drinking wine, pretending we're alright. What's strange is that I want you to love me. I'll tell you all I've done, in hopes that you'll say that you are proud, though the weight of your words is none. Why do I pine for your embrace when tears are all I'm left? Your words are shallow, and so will be the grave I lay you to rest. Every year on the 4th of July, we gather round the fire, telling your stories and drinking wine, pretending we're alright, pretending we're alright.
Well, in my home in Northwest Florida, this is the weather I love the most. This is the weather I love the most. Winter has come and gone, and it's left us with humidity, and the mosquitoes are out, and they are destroying and pillaging the land. They are killing people with Florida-specific airborne diseases. The yellow flies are just starting to make their appearance. A yellow fly bite will land you in the hospital for 7 days with an allergic reaction. It's a wonderful time of year, wonderful time of year. The poison ivy is growing and it's blooming. In the Black Creek area of the Choctawhatchee Bay, right there on the edge of the bay, the north side, where the bayous lead to the bay. Bayous snake backward into these canals. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful country. My cousin Ed Lee and I used to go run these canals in the forest, and we'd dodge the cattails, and we'd fish these canals that led to the bayous that led to the bay, and we would catch things and we would just throw them back, because there's nothing better than catching something and throwing it back. And this trains you for being a fisherman when you're much older. It trains you to know what it feels like to lose something. Because fishing as an adult is nothing like it was when you were a kid. When you were a kid, it didn't matter what you caught. When you're an adult, you go out and you realize, my God, I have no talent. And it trains you as a child, throwing something back. It trains you for loss. And so this is why we teach our children to throw things back. There was this old house on the edge of the woods, an old clapboard white house with a rusted roof, and it was built upon brick pylons, and it had sunk a little bit from the moisture which had laden the northwest Floridian ground and saturated it, made it soggy. And so the house had set a little bit to the left, so it was just a little off center, and leaned a little bit to the west. And there was an old woman who lived there, and her name was Miss Murtis. Miss Murtis. She was a single woman, or at least ever since we'd known her, she'd been a single woman. But she was like every church lady you'd ever known. Went to the Methodist church all her life, went to that Methodist church. And she'd sit there on the porch, that leaning porch, and sometimes she would have a little wad of something in her lower lip. Women from her generation often had wads in their lower lip. And she would spit brown spit into a little cup. And we'd say, "What's that in your lower lip?" She'd say, "That's just Grandmama's joy." Grandmama's joy. She was an interesting woman, a good woman. Her son had been raised by her, but was not her son biologically. It was truly her grandson, and his parents had been killed, both his parents killed in a car accident when he was a boy, and she had assumed parental control over him when she had raised him to the best of her ability. He never gave her any grandkids, but she always referred to herself as Grandmama. Grandmama. She was like most women of her generation and of her kind, Methodist church ladies, women with white frilly hair who knew how to wear pearls to church when the occasion called for it. And whenever there was a funeral, they would call upon Miss Murtis to make her famous deviled eggs. It was the only thing a woman like the sanctified woman could do that involved the word devil. And she did it well. She did it well enough to make the devil want to try the eggs that bore his name. They were made with Duke's mayonnaise, salt and pepper, and chunks of dill pickle relish, not sweet pickle relish. She'd rather be shot in the head and drug off a very shallow cliff than make a deviled egg with a sweet pickle relish. Likewise, she would never use anything in these deviled eggs besides Duke's mayonnaise or Blue Plate mayonnaise. Any other mayonnaise is completely inferior to a woman of her kind. She was a good woman. She would tell us stories about the old days and about what it was like growing up in an era when cars had chrome bumpers and when families would take their whole pictures in front of these cars. They'd stand in front of these rounded cars and they would get their photographs taken, the whole family. People don't do that today. A family would look very, very strange standing in front of their Prius, getting their photo taken and hung on the wall. But back then they did those sorts of things. She told us about her husband. She told us about her husband and how he had a wood shop. His wood shop was perched about an acre from her house right there. In the distance we could see it still standing. She said it didn't always look like that. It didn't always look like that. Long, long ago, that wood shop was made out of heart pine logs that had been hand hewn by my husband, she said. And then one day he was steam bending a piece of wood for the Methodist church staircase. The altar had these curved steps, and he was out there steam bending a piece of wood. And the flame underneath his steamer caught fire to some dried wood that was in the corner, and it went up in flames in a matter of seconds, and the whole wood shop disintegrated to the ground. She said, oh, it was horrible. Oh, it was horrible. She said he didn't know what he was going to do. He thought he'd have to give up cabinet making and woodworking altogether. She said, but it wasn't a few days later that people came driving up with these flatbed trailers full of lumber and tin metal roofing, and men riding on the back with their shirts off and tool belts on. And do you know, Sean, in 2 days, they built us a brand new wood shop. She said when my husband stood on the porch to observe it when it was all said and done, he got out his checkbook and he started to write a check to the man who brought the lumber, and the man held his hands up and said, no. This is what we do for each other. She told us these kinds of stories that had a nostalgic, a golden glow to them. Sometimes she'd take us into town. She had a Lincoln Continental that was about as big as a Waffle House. You could get lost in those floorboards if you weren't careful. She'd drive and she'd take a curve and you'd fall off your back bench seat and you'd fall down into the floorboards and you would see something moving down there underneath the cavern beneath the seat, and you would realize it was an immigrant who had gotten lost in her car and could not find his way out from underneath the seat. And so you would give him whatever candy you had on you or whatever licorice whips you had in your pockets to help him survive for another decade. She was a good woman, solid woman, sitting on that porch. I can still see her sitting on that porch. She would call us and say, hey, would you like to know how to make a fishing pole? And my cousin Ed Lee and I would look at each other and go, make a fishing pole? I'd never heard of such. She said, yeah, I'll tell you how we used to do it. I'll show you how we used to make it. Go down there and get me some river cane. We'd run down there and we'd pick 2 big pieces of river cane and we'd run it up back to her. We'd run barefoot through the longleaf pine trees and the cob lilies and the pine straw forest, and she would take these pieces of cane pole and she'd say, you know, you really ought not run barefoot out there in the woods like that. You know why? We'd say, why? She'd say, because of ground ditch. We'd say, well, what's ground ditch? She said, well, have you ever stepped on a hooey out in your backyard from your dog? My cousin Ed Lee looked at me and said, twice a day, whether I need it or not. She said, well, that hooey will make your feet itch, and that itch will crawl up to your ankles. My cousin Ed Lee said, oh, yeah, I had something like that last year. The doctor had to give me a shot to take it away. She said, that's the ground ditch. She said, you might know it as hookworm. She would make these fishing poles by trimming the top and the bottom off these large pieces of river cane with her little pocket knife. And while that little wad would be tucked in her lower lip, she would get a remnants from an old hanger and she'd clip it with tin snips and take little pieces of wire, wrap it around her finger to make an eyelet, and she'd attach it to that cane pole and wrap it with nylon threading until it was real secure. And these were placed at little increments along that pole as eyelets. And then she would get an old reel salvaged from an old fishing pole in her attic, and she would fix it to the bottom of this pole and then wrap the handle of the pole with electrician's tape, and she'd hand it to us and she'd say, there you go. Now that's how you catch a fish. And my cousin Ed Lee look at it and he'd go, well, it sure ain't very pretty, is it? And she'd say, looks don't matter. It's the love that matters. And we would run and we'd go to that creek and we would cast our lines into the water and we would reel it back in, and them poles were good enough if you only caught something that was beneath 0.5 ounces. If you caught anything that was above 0.5 ounces, that sucker'd break and you'd lose your rod and reel and it'd just fall right into Black Creek and it'd be washed out through the canals, into the bayou, into the bay, and be gone forevermore. So you can imagine, after some of the things I've just told you, how I felt when I heard, my cousin Ed Lee called me and said, Miss Murtis had passed away. I was real distraught. And so my cousin Ed Lee and I showed up to a Methodist church way out in the sticks one day. This church way out in the woods with wood floors and wood pews and wood ceilings that reverb everybody's voices when they sing, and it reverbs the preacher's voice. When he speaks, it doesn't need a microphone. He doesn't need any amplification. He just speaks the words that are old words, and they hit your ears, reverbing off old wood. And this church was swarmed with people, swarmed with them. My cousin Ellie and I sat in the very back pew. We looked up front, and the preacher man got to the stage, and he said, Miss Murtis had a few requests before she died. One of her requests was that there be no eulogy given by the clergy, but by the laity, by common people in the audience. That's you. And so, as soon as he said it, people started forming a line at the side of that church, right there in the lane between the pews and the stained glass windows on the east wall. And they formed this line, one after another, after another, after another, because there's nothing a Methodist likes more than having the stage and being able to talk at will without anybody interrupting. If you don't believe me, just go visit the Methodists on what is known as Testimony Night. Testimony night is the night when the preacher didn't have the stamina that week to write up a sermon. And so he turns over the floor to anybody and everybody who has a story to tell. And of course, the only problem is some people are not very, very adept at telling a logical, chronological story. And so you will get Brother Willard up there who only knows the story of his own divorce. This is what you will hear on a Wednesday night in a Methodist church when the preacher opens up the floor. In fact, my father used to say there's nothing a Methodist likes more than the sound of his own voice. And this is absolutely true. Just go visit a church on a Wednesday night for testimony night. But there was something happening. While I sat there in the pew and I listened to the first person deliver a memory about Miss Murtis, I was watching this man tell a story from the heart. And something happened inside me. And this feeling went downward from my chest to my stomach and into my legs and knees, and my knees locked, and I shot straight up out that pew, and I walked toward that line of people, and I joined the line. My cousin Eddie looked at me with his teeth clenched. He said, "What are you doing?" And while I stood in line, I was thinking to myself of what I was going to say about this woman, this fine, fine woman. I was listening to these stories that were being delivered from the stage, but I wasn't truly listening to their words. I was only listening to how they were speaking in the warmth that was dripping off their voices like syrup, and I was trying to figure out what I was going to say, what memory I was going to share. Do I talk about that little pouch in her lower lip? Do I even mention that? I'm not sure I should. Or do I talk about the cane poles? Or do I talk about her lopsided house? And one by one, the people delivered their stories, and they'd leave the stage. And one by one, they would be greeted by the pastor, who would give them a handkerchief, and they would walk back to their pew. And soon it was my turn. It was my turn. And I stepped up onto that wooden altar of God, and I looked out at the people who were all looking at me. The church was just packed. Just packed. And I started to deliver a story with all my heart, my eyes closed, and my voice ringing across that wooden room. And something happened to me. I've never been much of a public speaker. Actually, I can look right now at your faces, and I know that you know this. I've never been much of a public speaker, but that day, my first entrance into actually speaking in public, the words were coming out of my mouth like poetry. I was speaking poetry. I was very impressed with the sound of my own voice. This is probably when I became a Methodist. And I told a story about a woman. I told a story about a woman who I knew, who was sweet, who would give us rides in her Lincoln Continental, who had had that radio in the center console, and she'd turn it up and it'd be Bill Gaither singing, and she'd sing right along with it. There's a woman who had the house in the woods, Black Creek, that was a little lopsided, who would teach us how to make cane poles for fishing that were just worth nothing, but they were fun to hold and look at. And something happened to me while I was talking. I noticed something behind me. There's a large white screen that had been rolled down behind me, and there were pictures, photographs being broadcast on this screen with a projector. I saw this tiny white light at the end of the auditorium staring at me, and I turned to look at these pictures behind me, and I saw images that were black and white being rolled through, one after another, of a woman with a family, and the pictures of old people standing in front of cars with rounded chrome bumpers and shiny rounded profiled cars that have disappeared from this world, with white walled tires and headlights that were perfect circles. And as these pictures ran through the years, this woman in the pictures got a little bit older. She went from a teenager to an older woman with lines on her face and sharp features and skin that began to look like tissue paper. The styles of glasses changed. They went from horn-rimmed to steel-rimmed to those godless-looking things we had in the 80s that were big enough to start a forest fire with. And I noticed something while I was looking at these photographs. And I become so transfixed with these photos that I quit talking altogether, and I just looked at them roll through the eras. I remembered photographs in Miss Murtis's house, right behind her sofa, on them sofa tables she had. And there were young photos of her with her family. And all my life, I had seen those photos when I'd go into Miss Murtis's house, and I noticed that she was an auburn redhead. The woman in these photographs behind me here had midnight black hair. I walked toward the edge of the stage and I peered downward into that casket, and I realized I had never seen that woman before in my life. This woman in the casket was not Miss Murtis. I was at a wrong funeral. I was just starting to shake and tremble, and I didn't know what I was doing on this stage. I about slipped into a coma and forgot my own name. And in this moment of trial and persecution, I did what any God-fearing man would do, what males have been doing since the beginning of time. I just kept on talking. I told stories I didn't even know I had in me. And when I ran out of stories, I started making them up. I just started telling stories about Miss Murtis, and I replaced the names of people in my life with her name. Finally, I noticed there toward the side of the altar, there was a man standing there in a tweed jacket, little old man with a bald head and a crimson red tie. And he crossed his arms across his chest, and he looked at me, and he just peered at me with this scowl on his hairy eyebrowed face. And finally, I just stopped talking. I let my words trail off, and I walked toward the edge of the platform. He walked toward me and he held out his hand. He said, "I'm Miss Murtis's husband. Just who in the hellfire are you?" I shook his hand and I gripped it tight. And I said, "Sir, once you've known one Miss Murtis, you've known them all." Hey, thanks very much for having me this evening. It's been a wonderful pleasure. I appreciate you having me. Thank you very much.
Hey, thanks for listening to Sean of the South. I've been your host today, Sean Dietrich. And man, it's been a bona fide pleasure, if I do say so myself. This episode was brought to you by Case Knives, a tradition of my family dating back to my granddaddy, who once said the best way to cure idle hands was to build something. So keep your hands sharp with a Case knife. And Folklore Brewing Company, quite literally the best brew in Alabama. Folklore Brewing Company took home 2 gold medals at the Alabama Craft Beer Championship. Do yourself a favor and check them out at Folklore Brewing in Meadridge. country.com. That wonderful music heard by me today was the Chatham Rabbits, North Carolina's own husband and wife duo who've played smoky bars, summer festivals, and busked on the streets of Nashville until their voices wore out. They played tunes at weddings and old-time church singings, and since this past summer, they decided to leave their corporate careers and take Chatham Rabbits full-time on the road, and since then, they have done incredibly well. You won't find too many people who don't know their name. Check out chathamrabbits.com, and while you're there, take the time to drop them a line and tell them how much you like their music, and download their album. You won't regret it. To find anything more about what I do, you can visit SeanoftheSouthShow.com, and there you can find archived episodes dating back to our first episode when we had absolutely no idea what we were doing, and by us, I mean me. While you're there, take the time to drop me a line to me about your birthday announcements, wedding invitations, and potluck socials, and I'll do my best to read them over there for my friends, because I love to do that sort of stuff for my friends. And speaking of friends, some people cause happiness wherever they go, and others cause happiness whenever they go away. Be one, but not the other. Adios.